Let me start at the beginning. First things first. I want to give you a little bit of background in terms of this particular topic because it's not necessarily your normal topic. I speak on a wide range of topics. Am I too loud for you guys? Is that too loud? Okay. Speak on a wide range of topics, and I speak to a lot of PMI audiences. I've been fortunate to go around the country. I've spoken in Milan, in Costa Rica, in Marseille, in Berlin. If anybody was in Berlin last May, I was there. I talk about communication skills, leadership skills, how to run effective meetings, wide range of topics. My big thing is I want to give you specific, practical techniques. Something that I hate more than anything is one of those talks where the speaker is up there and they're all lofty, pie in the sky, la-di-da, all this great warm stuff that kind of gets y'all lathered up. And then you get back to your desk on Monday and you're like, that's an hour of my life I'll never get back. What in the world am I actually going to do differently? So I try to be really, really practical. One of the things that I noticed was no matter what the topic was, whether it was a communication technique, a facilitation skills technique, a project management technique, after I would give my talk and I would open it up for Q&A, one of the very first questions I would always get was some version of, yes, Dana, I hear that, that sounds great, but what do I do if the problem is my boss, okay? How do I do that if my boss is in the room? You know, how do I deal with a difficult client? What if my project sponsor is not really helping us? He's really the problem. And so I started noticing this consistency no matter where I was, no matter what the topic was. So because of that, back in 2010, I wrote a white paper for PMI called The Project Manager's Guide to Dealing with the Difficult Sponsor. So that was back in 2010. And then over the years, I started kind of accruing more and more best practices for managing difficult bosses and managing difficult sponsors. Then in 2016, I was giving a talk in Chicago at the Global Congress that PMI had in Chicago. And then a publisher reached out to me and said, hey, we kind of like this topic. We think there's something here. We want you to write a book. And so I started to do research for this book that later, well, I guess it came out about a week ago, The Unwritten Rules of Managing Up Project Management Techniques from the Trenches. So as I was getting ready to write the book, I said, well, you know, I've got my own experience, but wouldn't it be great to get a lot of experience from a lot of real project managers and even non-project managers? What do you do? What have you done? I mean, there's thousands, there are millions of difficult bosses out there. I want to hear about those stories. I want those experiences. So I didn't have, like he was talking about Twitter, I have a network, but, you know, I'm not like Oprah, you know, and I could just put something out there and I'm going to get millions of responses. And I know how people are with surveys. Who likes surveys? Nobody, okay? Nobody fills out surveys. So I said, gosh, I'm going to put this survey out there and then I'm going to get crickets. I'm going to have like 3 responses and that's going to look even worse than if I didn't do the survey. I was really wrestling with should I do the survey or not. I said, whatever, I'm going to do the survey. So I created this survey because I wanted to get some real empirical data and some anecdotal data too. So I put this survey out there. I said, oh, let me just put something together. And I asked lots of questions, particularly about how have you had difficult bosses in the past? How common was it? What are some of the different types of difficult bosses? I put different names out there. And then I had a lot of open-ended questions. I said, well, just, you know, tell me everything. What did you do? What worked? What didn't work? So I put it out there. And then you're, you know, kind of waiting. I got 1,173 responses in about 3 weeks. I was blown away. I got tons and tons of feedback. I think people thought it was cathartic. They just wanted to get it out. They wanted to vent. They wanted to complain. So getting all that information together, all of that is what went into the book and what went into this presentation. So that's kind of the backstory. That's the genesis of how we got to where we are now. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about over the next hour and a half or so. So here are our topics. First, I want to talk about what is managing up. How many of you hadn't really heard that phrase before? You know, nobody wants to admit it now. Okay, that was one of the very common comments that I got in the survey, where they read through it and they said, you know, I've been doing this for years, but I didn't really know what it was called. I didn't know what the label was. So I want to just define it. I want to demystify it. Then we're going to get into the meat. We are going to look at some of the specific common varieties, flavors of the difficult boss. Managing the tornado. The tornado is the one that's like, you know, hey, don't mind me intimidating everybody in your meeting. I'm just trying to help you speed things along. How many of you have had a tornado? Okay, it may not be your current boss, but you've been around a tornado. You have seen that in the workplace, okay? People are raising their hand like this. You might be sitting next to the tornado, or you might be the tornado. My husband told me part of the reason why I was so great at writing this book was because I was all the personalities. How about the clueless chameleon? This is the type of boss or sponsor who says, you know, I'm not exactly sure what I really want, but I'm still going to hold you responsible if you don't deliver it. Okay? Have you ever had that person who changes their mind, or on Monday they wanted this, but on Friday they want that? So we're going to talk about that clueless chameleon. Or maybe the scope keeps creeping and changing, or the requirements change. How about the wishful thinker? This is the one that wants you to boil the ocean by tomorrow if possible, okay? They ask for the impossible. Have you seen that? Yes, we're project managers. I know we've seen that. The naked emperor. Oh, all of my ideas are brilliant. Aren't they brilliant? In the project management world, we like to say this is the one that, you know, nobody wants to tell the boss they have an ugly baby, okay? So how do you speak up and say something to the naked emperor? I need my glasses. MIA boss. Have you guys had an MIA project sponsor before, or boss, or client, somebody who's just not around to really support the project? We'll talk about that. And then, actually, I think this might be different. I think I might have changed this, the weakling or the micromanager. Because when I sent the survey out, I didn't have the micromanager on there, and I got so much feedback that we need to hear about the micromanager, so I added that. So there's a chapter on the micromanager in the book. So let's start at the beginning. And I'm going to tell you, I really like to be interactive. So I'm going to talk for a good part of this, but we're going to do a couple case studies, and I'm also going to ask to hear from you. So at some point, I'm going to turn it around. So I want you guys to start thinking about your stories, your examples, because I am going to ask to hear from you, and we do have prizes, so there are benefits to speaking up. All right, so let's start at the beginning. What is managing up? Lots of different definitions we can use for this, but you know, one of my favorites here, taking things off your boss's plate and helping them be more effective. Sometimes this means helping them help you. I like to say managing up is a win-win, because you truly are looking for opportunities to make your boss, your senior leader, your executive be more effective. And sometimes that means proactively helping them minimize their weaknesses. But guess what? If you've got a bad boss, if you've got a highly flawed boss, what impact do you think that potentially has on you and your career? Not good, okay? So that's what I mean by helping them help you, and it's really a win-win. So when we talk about what does managing up look like, what does that really look like in the workplace? It could be anticipating problems and actively working to solve them. So if we see the ship is headed for the iceberg, we're actually saying something. We're trying to be proactive about it. There's some risk management there. It's adjusting your style and your approach to better fit their preferences. I was giving a talk to a nuclear power organization in Atlanta. And we did this activity talking about customizing your communication preferences or your communication style based on your boss's preferences. And I said that that really starts with figuring out what each person's preferences are or is. And this is a technique that I've used with a lot of teams that I've worked with, that I've coached, consulted with. I love it. It's called 4 walls. We just label each wall with a different communication mode. So we've got face-to-face, email, instant message, text, and phone. and I just ask each person to walk to the wall that's their preferred communication style. So really, really quickly, I mean literally in 30 seconds, you can see, oh, that's why she's always showing up at my desk. Okay, she's really a face-to-face person. So to me, it always starts with awareness. So we did that activity. And then you go to each group and you say, tell us why you prefer that mode. Tell us some of your pet peeves. Well, if you are going to email, don't BCC, all that kind of good stuff. So we go around and we do that. After we finished the activity, we sat down, and one of the women in the audience, she said, Dana, you left off one of the main modes that I use every single day. And I was like, okay, what's that? And she was like, Post-it. I mean, I do half my communicating with my boss by Post-it, because what I realized is I could email him all day long. He's not going to pay attention to that. You know, he's like, if it's important, I need to write it on a Post-it, and I slap it on his door. Okay, and that is how we communicate. That's what's worked best for us. So that's just such a great example of what I'm talking about here. She customized. She really figured out what works, what isn't working, to try to come up with something that's really going to best suit him. So certainly that's really, really important. Being flexible and willing to take on the dog projects that nobody wants. People love having those people on their team. Speaking truth to power. This is telling them they've got the ugly baby, okay? Nobody wants to do that. There are lots of projects and organizations that never should have become projects in the beginning. They're this big, hairy, ugly project that 6 months, 12 months down the road, you're scratching your head saying, why are we even doing this? And it's because some executive somewhere thought it was a brilliant idea, but nobody would tell them the truth. In project management, we tend to say, kill what's ugly while it's young. Okay? Because when you don't, you end up with something that you almost can't kill because you're so far into it. It becomes so much harder 3 months in, 6 months in. You say, well, we've devoted all these resources to it. We might as well just see it through now. So that's what we're talking about, speaking truth to power early on. And then finally, learning to navigate those prickly or difficult boss personalities. And this is where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time here today. But I first wanted to start with a big high-level overview to say managing up isn't just about difficult bosses. That's kind of the piece that people, you know, get excited about and want to hear about. It's really the entire umbrella. It's doing all of this stuff so that you're helping your senior leaders be most effective. Now, let's talk about what it isn't. Part of defining is not just talking about what it is, but what it isn't. I promise you, a recipe for career disaster is thinking that you are now your boss and you are now going to tell them what to do, okay? Managing up is not taking over. It's not overruling your boss, your sponsor. You did not get a raise, a promotion. You are now not empowered to make whatever decisions you want. So that's not what we're talking about. Don't get it twisted at all. Doesn't mean that we're changing the scope, the goals, ignoring political realities, or suspending common sense. This is something that I absolutely need you to hear. I'm going to give you so many tips and techniques over the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Part of the reason why I'm giving you so many is I don't know which one's going to work. I don't know your crazy boss. I mean, I don't know what's going to work for this person versus that person. So I'm giving you kind of a bag of tricks so that you can pull different things out in different situations with different personalities. Now, I mentioned before, I think that managing upper is very win-win. A lot of the feedback I got on the survey, I have to admit, I was really surprised, was leaders saying to me, I wish people did this more. You know, I wish. There was one woman on the survey who said her boss came to her when she first started working for her and said, look, we can do this one of two ways. You can be proactive and manage me and look at my calendar and figure things out. He said, or I can hunt you down for status updates on a regular basis. We can do it either way, but I prefer the former, okay? So most bosses, most leaders, strong ones in particular, tend to like it. Having said that, okay, everybody's not the same. So let me give you an analogy. I was talking to someone over here earlier who worked for a French company. So we were talking about France just a little bit. And I've spent, I feel like, half my adult life trying to learn French. And so before I was going to go, I started going in my 20s. And before I went the first time, they always said, well, they really, really appreciate it if you at least make an effort, if you try to speak French. So wherever you are, at least try. And that was great for me because that was the whole reason why I was going. I mean, my pronunciation was horrible, but I had taken a lot of French classes. So my vocabulary was actually pretty extensive. And most people, as they said, they really liked it. I mean, I could tell that, I was kind of stumbling through, but they would kind of work with me and they appreciated the fact that I was trying. And then one day I remember I was walking down the street and I was trying to ask the guy the name of the cross street over there. And I knew that I was using the right words, but clearly my pronunciation was so horrible, he was not having it, okay? So whenever I talked to him in French, he responded back to me in English. And then what did I do? I just continued to talk in English, okay? I am not gonna fight the system. The same thing here. If you start being more proactive, if you start using some of these techniques and you feel like it's making it worse or you're getting resistance, there's some leaders who are really intimidated, like maybe they feel like you're trying to take over, you're trying to take their job. You wanna respond to that, okay? So this is a really, really important point. You never want to ignore political realities or suspend common sense. If it seems like it's not helping, then you want to revert course. You want to take that feedback from them as well. Managing up is not trying to fix somebody. We all come to the workplace as a cumulative result of all of our life experience. And I promise you, some of us are irrevocably broken, okay? You are not their therapist, their psychiatrist, their psychologist. You are not there to fix them. And then finally, it's not taking abuse. I posted an article on LinkedIn. How many of you are on LinkedIn? Everybody should be on LinkedIn, and please link in with me. I try to post really, really great content. So please, please, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I posted an article on LinkedIn probably a couple months ago about managing difficult boss personalities. It was about customizing. It was about how to customize your style to best suit your boss. And then one of the comments that somebody put in there, she was like, you could tell she was like in the thick of it. She was like, at what point do you just realize that this is not a fit? That this is not gonna work. I mean, how much customization should you have to do for another individual? I was like, woo, okay. But I really appreciate it. I said, oh my gosh, you are so, so right. I said, you know what? Customization does not mean turning yourself into a pretzel to make something work that clearly is not going to work. And in the book, I actually talk about this DEFCON scale. I say, hey, you could be in a DEFCON 5 environment, which is wonderful, your boss is great, all the way down to DEFCON 1. DEFCON 1 is all out nuclear war, okay? And so I say the book is for DEFCON 5, 4, 3, and 2, okay? If you are at DEFCON 1, you need to close the book. You need to hop on monster.com. You need to look for other opportunities. You might need to call EAP, call an attorney, call 911. But there truly, truly are toxic situations out there, toxic work environments. I mean, you should see some of the feedback I got on this survey. People were talking about their boss shows up to work drunk. I mean, just like physical abuse. I mean, just all kinds of things. The book is not going to help with that, okay? So it's not about taking abuse, certainly. See, now you feel better about your situation, don't you? Okay, so we've already really gone through a lot of these personalities, so I don't necessarily want to belabor it. But these are 6 of the personalities, and as I said, the micromanager is in there as well. So enough of my talking. Now we want to do a scenario. We want to do a case study, and I really, really do want to hear from you guys. And if we do have some handheld mics, that might be helpful as we do the debrief. Consider the scenario. You're staring out the window trying to calm yourself because you just left a team meeting that was railroaded by your trusty project manager, Sam. Although you were initially glad to see that Sam wasn't one of those missing in action bosses who would never show up to a meeting, you're now starting to regret his overbearing almost aggressive presence in your project meetings. Instead of team meetings speaking up to raise important points or ask questions, everybody just politely nods and tells Sam how great his ideas are. His participation is definitely starting to have a negative impact on the effectiveness of the team, okay? Can we relate to that scenario, all right? Might not be you in your exact situation now, but at some point, I promise you, if you've not encountered a tornado style, a very kind of overbearing, very aggressive personality, you will likely at some point in your career. The question becomes, what do you do? So I want you to talk at your table. I want you to envision this scenario. You're back in your office. You're looking at the window. What should be your next step? What do you think you should do in the future when you have this situation? So talk at your table, and then after we'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes to talk through it, and then we're going to do some readouts, and I want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? Let's see what we've come up with. So we've got 2 microphones on either side of the room. They're going to try to come to you. So let's see some hands. Who's got some ideas to share? What do you think you actually would do? I mean, it's a tricky situation. We've got a hand right here, this woman right here. If we can go to her. And then there's somebody in the back there as well. Yeah, her, okay.
So I tried to figure out what might be the hot button for this person. If you can get to that root cause and try to preempt that concern, you can sometimes prevent them from steamrolling the meeting and give them a little more peace of mind, because sometimes that's what's triggering that, that action.
That is super, super smart. Figure out what their hot button issue is. Everybody's kind of got one. And sometimes it's like a landmine when you go over it and you don't realize that you kind of went over it, and then it kind of implodes and you can't get it back. So a few things there that she alluded to. One, I say preempt with planning. Also, the other thing is, if they've got this kind of personality, 9 times out of 10, you know they've got this personality. I mean, if they're like a little rabid dog, you know that. I mean, it's not like a surprise when you show up at the meeting. So if the meeting's on Friday, don't wait till Friday. Get on their calendar on Monday, okay? Take them to Starbucks, lather them up a little bit, and then you want to, as she said, if there's a particular issue that you know is a hot button issue with them, it's almost like, you know, you're trying to have your contained pre-meeting with them. So if they're going to go, you know, left, let them go left with you one-on-one so that it doesn't happen in the session. The other point that I'll make along those same lines is if you think there's a potentially provocative or explosive topic, make that the last thing on the agenda. Okay, consciously, I always do that. So that way, if it goes off the rails, at least I've made it all the way through everything. Sometimes if that's the first thing, you'll never get to the second thing. So that's super, super smart. Figure out what that hot button topic or issue is. Okay, others, yes.
So I've recently had this situation in my office, and I pulled the individual aside because I know that my team is built of a lot of people with varying experiences.
Yeah.
And it turns out that in the past, that was his mode of operation because no one would take ownership. Oh. So he was not aware that he even brought this to the table. So we had a conversation about it. He didn't know that people were shutting down, and ultimately I helped him understand that this was affecting the productivity and the success of his team.
Yes.
Because of the way he was operating. And it was received well, and he made some adjustments, and we were able to move forward.
Yes. I am so glad that you said that. Now, isn't that a brave thing to do? Let's be honest. I mean, that's pretty brave. That's pretty sophisticated. I would say that going there is a function maybe of your level of maturity, your comfort level, and also your level of relationship with them. Okay? There are some techniques that you're going to be able to do if you have a strong relationship. I mean, I was fortunate. I worked with a director where we had a really, really strong relationship. I could be as blunt as I wanted to be. There were other people I had zero relationship. I felt like I could tell them almost nothing. So I do think that that's a huge, huge factor. But she made such an important point. I don't even have this in this talk, but I just want to expound on this for a minute. Because sometimes I'm on the other side. I'm talking to leaders who are dealing with people in the organization who are not performing. And they always ask me, Dana, you know, should I invest in this person or should I find them a new home, okay? And I say, you know what, there are 3 things that anyone needs in order to enhance their performance in an area. But the problem is you have to have all 3. It's awareness, ability, and motivation, okay? And the problem is most people don't take the time to figure out what's missing. They just say, oh, okay, she's horrible with this, let's just send her to training. Well, training's not really gonna help if it's not an ability issue, if it's a motivation issue. So you've gotta figure out what's the problem, and then you can deduce what do I need to do to respond to that. But the very first issue you've got to address is awareness. What is the first step of 12 steps? Admitting that there is a problem. Okay? It's not a coincidence that that is the very first thing you have to do. Because if you don't acknowledge it, if you don't have awareness, if you don't admit that there is a problem, you are not going to work to fix it. You don't invest energy in fixing problems that you don't acknowledge. So it must start with awareness. So what she said was so key. And this is so common. I see it both ways. I see people who are individual contributors who've been there for 10, 20 years and nobody's ever told them they have a problem. I've seen people who got promoted out of a group because the boss was so ready to get rid of them. Instead of being honest with them and saying, no, you're not a 1. I know you've gotten 1s for the past 15 years, but you're not a 1. You're far from a 1 in terms of performance rating. So it might sound like a small issue, but it is a huge issue. Everything starts with awareness. Now, let me go back to what I said at the very beginning. I can give you that technique, but you can throw it back at me and say, but what if they are my boss? That is a hard thing to do. Let me give you an example of a technique that's in the book that I talk about. Because one thing that I do in there is I try to give specific wording. Because it's one thing to say a technique, but then you say, okay, well, how do I word that? Or, you know, what do I actually say? And that one is one in particular where I give lots of different examples of wording. One of the techniques I personally like to use with senior leaders or bosses or someone where I want to create some awareness, you know, I want to give them some feedback, but it's like, how do you really kind of give your boss feedback? So one of the things that I do is after the meeting, like let's say they were a hot mess in the meeting and I'm like, I got to, you know, figure out how to work on this. So after the meeting, I schedule some time on their calendar to debrief. And I say, hey, Jim, you know, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, your being there. I just wanted to take a minute to kind of unpack the meeting, kind of debrief and see how you think things went. I mean, obviously, one of the critical elements is we need to get super candid, super honest feedback from them. And so I just wanted to kind of get your view on how you think things went. So what I do is I ask them for their feedback on the session. That does 2 things. One, that clues me in on are they aware or are they not? Because if they say, oh yeah, I think it was great, I think it was wonderful, and they talked the whole time and we didn't hear from anybody else, then I've got a larger problem. But 2, it also gives them a chance to really reflect and think on it. A lot of times they might go in there and be a bull in a china shop and then they go to their next meeting and they're not even thinking about that meeting. They haven't really taken time to consider, well, wait a minute. She said the goal was we really wanted to get a lot of candid, honest feedback from others. Well, I don't know if we really did that so much. So it provides a space and an opportunity for them to kind of critique their own behavior instead of me having to come in and critique their behavior. And I will say, a majority of the time, that process does give a space for them to see, well, you know, now that I think about it, maybe we didn't hear as much from some of the other people, and maybe I should kind of hold back, you know, a little bit more. Now, certainly, if they're completely clueless, they're not getting any of it, that's where you can kind of gently step in and say, well, you know, one of the things I noticed was I think we talked about 40 minutes. I know your idea about the inventory was important. I feel like we talked a lot about that, but we didn't really get a chance to address some of the marketing issues, and I know how important that is to you as well. So that might be how I would start that conversation about how we tended to focus here, but I don't feel like I achieved what we really wanted to achieve in this space. And so that's one way to massage that. But that's wonderful feedback. What else? What's something else you would do? Yes, over here.
A little bit about maybe having 2 separate meetings, like a functional meeting with your team and then just an update meeting perhaps with the boss to prevent them from taking over. You know, it's dependent on time and things, but that might be an option.
That is a super smart idea. Anybody ever done that? Where you kind of break it out? Yeah, that can be really, really helpful. Another twist on that is sometimes I will just have them show up for the first 15 minutes and then leave. So I say, hey, I really kind of need you to do the rah-rah. And let me kind of unpack that a little bit more. When you're having that pre-meeting, if I'm anticipating that my boss is possibly going to be problematic, one of the things that I'll do in this pre-meeting is I'll say, hey, you know, Jim, thank you so much for, you know, coming to the meeting. I think it's so critical that people see you. Let's face it, you're the VP. When you're in the room, it changes the dynamic, and, you know, people really look up to you. They get really excited, so it's really, really helpful. I'm going to be completely, or I might say, hey, can I be completely honest? You know, yeah, yes, you can be completely honest. Okay. The only concern I have is because everyone looks up to you so much, a concern I have is they're just going to piggyback on whatever you say. So instead of us putting the onus on them to really think about their piece of the business and come up with some really unique, solid ideas, I'm a little bit concerned that as soon as you voice what your thoughts are or the direction you think we should go, then everyone's just going to glom onto that. And then we're not even going to hear from them. We're kind of taking the responsibility off them and putting it onto you. That's really my only concern. What do you think about that? Do you see what I've done there? Okay. So now I'm not telling them, hey, I need you to pipe down. I need you to be quiet. What I'm saying is, and keep in mind, these senior level people, they're counselors. They're very, very comfortable in that role. They're comfortable with people coming to them with challenges and issues and them being kind of Oz and them fixing it. So I'm coming to him and I'm bringing him or her the challenge, the issue, and then I'm leaving it open. They're not used to being told what to do. That's something they don't generally respond well to. So that's something that I'm intentionally trying to avoid. So instead of me coming in with my idea, and this is what I think we should do, I'm going to come with the problem and ask them what they think we should do. And then usually that works pretty well. Usually they'll say, this is how I came up with my 15-minute, because usually they're the ones that say, well, maybe I shouldn't stay for the whole session. Maybe I'll just pop in for the first 10, 15 minutes and then I'll leave. And then we can sync up afterwards and have like that separate meeting that she was talking about. And then I'll say, oh, you know, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that might be great. Or there are lots of different ways to do it. They might say, well, okay, I see what you're saying. So you know what I'll do? I'll hold back. I won't really say anything. We want to hear from them first. And then what I do is I say, oh, you know what? I'm going to hold back too. So you and I will hold back because I don't want them to feel alone. I don't want them to feel ostracized. I'll say, okay, we'll hold back because we really want to get honest feedback from them first, and then we'll chime in at the end. So that can be a great technique, a way to finesse that conversation. Let's get one more technique before we move on to the next type of difficult sponsor. One more, yes, this lady right here in gray and blue.
So it kind of ties into what everybody said. We said have an agenda and allocate actually minutes. So like, you know, you can keep them 15 minutes for this topic, 10 minutes for that topic. If they come in with their brilliant ideas, you can point them back to the agenda. Also have a parking lot.
Yes.
So that you're affirming that, yes, we heard your idea and we will address that, but we'd like to stay on task.
Yes. So she's bringing up some really important practical issues. I want to be sure we don't skip over those, so thank you for that. One, have a parking lot. Do you guys use parking lot? Okay. Be sure your parking lot does not become a graveyard, okay? So once stuff goes up on the parking lot, you do need to have 5 minutes at the end to go through it. Another little tiny facilitation technique I use is I try to have Post-its or something for each person, and when a parking lot item comes up, I don't write it down. See, that's a huge mistake I think a lot of PMs make when they're leading their own meetings. Is they're leading, they're facilitating, they're scribing, they're doing everything. They're like an octopus. You will slow down your own meeting. So when the issue comes up, I ask the person, I say, hey, would you mind jotting that down and putting it on the parking lot? So that way I'm free to continue to move on with the session. She mentioned having timings next to each section. That is really helpful as well, because then if it says 10 minutes, we all know what 10 minutes feels like. If we've been talking about this for 20, 30 minutes, we need to move on. A little communication technique that I use with that is the phraseology. I'll tend to say something along the lines of, hey, I know we have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. Or, I know that we all want to wrap up by 4. Because I promise you, even that long-winded person in the meeting wants to get out on time. So I usually mention something about getting out on time, because that will usually allow people to redirect a lot easier. So you want to have the timings, you want to have the parking lot. Oh, the last thing I was going to mention is one of the techniques that I talk about in here called complement, document, and pivot. You can use this with anyone, but I've certainly used it with the tornado. And that is, because we've all been in those sessions where the person's going on, and we need to move on, but you feel like you don't want to be rude and say, hey, we need to move on. So I usually use this kind of technique called complement, document, and pivot. So let's say they're bringing up this issue about getting a different supplier, but they're kind of going on and on about it. So instead of your natural urge when they're going on and on is you're sitting there thinking like, why will they shut up? I need to move on. I need to get them to shut up. But unfortunately, our natural dynamic, when you press on people and you're pushing on people, what do you think their natural reflexive response is? To push back. And they almost become a broken record. Have you heard that on conference calls or seen it in meetings? Where it's like, well, she's not getting it, so I need to say it again. It's like they're going on. They're like a dog with a bone with this. So what I found is instead of trying to shut them up, you do the exact opposite. You actually acknowledge their point. So it sounds like you're saying we really might need to think about changing vendors completely. Honestly, I'm so glad you brought that up. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know about other people. Let me be sure we document that so we don't lose it. That is such a great point. So then I write it either on a flip chart, whiteboard, or even in a virtual meeting. I'll write it out on the virtual meeting space. With that, I'm making her know that she's been heard. She can let it go. I am acknowledging it. I'm vocalizing it. I am documenting it for us all to see. That's why the documentation is important. I don't just want to talk about it. I want to document it somewhere. So that way it's not going anywhere. We got it. Okay? Then I'm going to pivot either to a different person or a different topic. So I'll write it up there. I'll say, consider supplier change, and then action item, follow up, and I'll put the person's name. I'll say, okay, that is such a great point. I know we've only got about 5 more minutes in this section. I like to get at least 3 more ideas. And then sometimes I'll physically put tick marks, 3 more tick marks. And I'll say, I wonder what John is thinking about this. Or John, that might impact your area. What are your thoughts? Or I've heard a good bit from this side of the room. What about that side of the room? That's a technique I use a lot of times when I don't want to call out a particular person or say, hey, you're talking too much. I need to go over here. I'll say, hey, I've heard from this side. What about this side of the room? Okay, so complement, document, and pivot. That can be really, really helpful. So here are the techniques that I've got listed here. We've talked about a lot of these. Conduct a round robin starting at the end, opposite from the boss. That's similar to what I was just doing. So if you're not familiar, round robin means instead of it being a free-for-all where everyone's just talking, and a lot of these you can use virtually as well. Instead of it being a free-for-all where there's no structure, I'll say, gosh, this is great feedback. I know we've only got about 10 more minutes. I do want to be sure I get at least 1 comment or 1 idea from each person. So let's do a quick round robin. So if my boss, my tornado's over here, I'm going to start over here. So this, I'll say, hey, let's start with Julie. And then I'll say, and then we'll go here, 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 here. They're still going to get their time, but now I've instituted a process where they can't just take over. So that can be really, really helpful. Pivot the conversation to ask for solutions or recommendations. Let's say your boss is one who's complaining or being negative. This is a technique I use not just for bosses, but for anybody who's venting, complaining, whining. Very, very simple. I usually try to pivot it and say, gosh, okay, I know the supplier is the problem. What are your thoughts? You know, and maybe you don't have to direct it just to them, but what are thoughts on solutions? How might we fix that? You know, what are some recommendations? Sometimes someone can vent and complain and whine. As soon as you ask them for a recommendation, they're like a deer in headlights. You know, one of our ground rules for our meetings used to be anytime you voice a complaint, you also must recommend at least 2 solutions. And that was just trying to change the culture in the room to say, hey, we don't have time to spend an hour complaining, okay? We need to focus on what we're going to do differently. The other technique that I use, and this is a sidebar. This one, I don't know necessarily that I would recommend it for bosses so much, but just a sidebar on this particular issue. A lot of times with my meetings, when they complain about something, I assign them the action item. So I usually would say, you know what, that's such an important point about changing vendors. We all know what a big deal that is. That's not something we're going to fix in the next 5 minutes, but I don't want to lose it. Would you mind taking the action to pull together some ideas and presenting that at the next meeting? Okay. So once people start to realize that they're going to kind of get some work out of the deal, it's amazing how that tempers their behavior somewhat. We've talked about repeating, validating their point. And then last but not least, if all else fails, say if you're sitting in a meeting room, stand up to kind of regain control. If that person feels like they're kind of taking over, stand up and walk around the room. You will regain control. All right? Does that make sense? Do you feel like any of those are helpful? Okay, so let's keep going. You just left another confusing meeting with your manager, Shelly. She means well and the team likes her, but trying to figure out what she really wants is like playing a weekly game of scavenger hunt. As soon as you think you're clear on her goals and expectations, it seems like she seems to shift priorities, assumptions, or focus. You're starting to worry that even though she may not be clear on what she wants, you'll still take the blame when it's not delivered. What do you do? And if you've had this type manager, or boss or sponsor, I want you to share that with your group as well. So let's again take about 3 to 5 minutes, talk through it, and then we'll unpack it and see what suggestions you have. All right. Let's hear what you guys would do. What do you think? What do you do? Yes. I got one here. Who else? So that, yeah, and then there's one in the back.
So we would definitely put something in writing. So we're sitting there with this person, the boss, and we, they're verbally telling us what they want, where they want to go. We put it in writing, say, here's what we wanted to do. So that way, if they go ahead and change and kind of give us a squirrel moment later on in the day, then we can say, okay, well, we're changing it. This is what we'd agreed to.
Right.
Please know that we're changing what we had originally agreed to.
Exactly. Documentation is your friend with the clueless chameleon, okay? So whether that documentation is more informal, like one of the comments I got from the survey, a ton, from people who felt like they managed up a lot, they said, as soon as I leave her office, I email her and say, hey, this is what we agreed to, this is what you said. Doesn't mean you're telling them they can't change their mind, but at least you want there to be the acknowledgement this actually is a change. I mean, it's one thing if they come to you and say, hey, I want to change something. We can handle that a lot better than they're talking to you as if they have amnesia, that they told you something completely different just a few weeks ago. So whether it's sending that email after a meeting or more formally within the project charter, okay? So I'm among friends, so I'm hoping we know what, project charter is, hoping we're using project charters, but having the documentation in the project charter. What are the goals? What's the scope? Let me tell you also something about scope. You don't just want to document what's in scope. What's out of scope. I promise you that out of scope list is really more important than the in scope list. Because the in-scope list is kind of the stuff we kind of know. The out-of-scope really shows you where the boundaries are. It really, we're doing domestic, we're not doing international. We're doing retail, we're not doing e-commerce. So you really do need that very, very clear listing of what is out of scope to provide that clarity. So again, with the clueless chameleon, something like that becomes very, very important. So you want to document that. There's another element. I'm trying to think, should I bring it in here? No, I won't bring it in here. Okay. But the project charter can be really, really helpful. So you want to document those things. And again, it's not saying that we can't have changes, but you still want that acknowledgement that, hey, this is what we said or this is what we agreed to. So documentation is key. All right, in the back, yes.
Well, we're going to tie back to the documentation comment, but we were talking about just asking more and more questions, continue to probe to try to get to your answer. However, I personally have had an experience where the IT director we were questioning said, just go do what you think I'm thinking.
Oh, wow. Can I borrow that, please?
Absolutely. You can put it in quotes.
Oh, I wish
Absolutely.
I knew it before I wrote the book. Oh, gosh.
Yes.
Just go do what you think I'm
thinking.
But you know what I like about that? Isn't it better when they at least acknowledge that they're scattered, they're all over the place? It's like I can at least work with that better when they say, you know, I don't really know what I want, as opposed to someone who pretends they know what they want, and then I do that, and then they come back and say, that's not what I want. That's not, you know, what I said. So oh my God, I can't even remember what you said before that. That was so good. Okay. What did you say before that? I can't remember. Oh, ask questions. So yes, this is so critical because at the end of the day, the issue is with the clueless chameleon, we have to get away from this binary philosophy or mental thought that they're going to ask me for X and I go do X. That's not the way it works with them. With them, it's iterative. It's like, okay, I'm kind of somewhere in this vicinity, and then you go out and you try to come up with something. Then you give it to them. And then they might say, well, I don't really know what I want, but I know it's not that. Okay, and at least you've eliminated something. At least you have a basis for getting a little bit closer to what it might be that you want. But asking those questions is so key for a number of reasons. First of all, some people will ask for a Lamborghini when a skateboard will do, okay? And sometimes, until and unless you really start to pull back the layers of the onion, you don't really figure that out. The other thing is a lot of times they don't know what they need. You know, like they say, the guy going to the hardware store on Saturday morning shopping for a drill really needs a hole. So it's kind of up to us to figure out, at the end of the day, what are you trying to do? It's like, help me help you. So let me figure out what it is you're trying to do. Back here, we've got a question or comment over here. So asking those questions, those clarifying questions, becomes really key. And let's say, remember before I said relationship, this all depends on relationship. If you've got a great relationship, you might be able to barrage them with a ton of blunt questions, no problem. But let's say you don't have that. Maybe explain, say, hey, Jim, I just want to let you know, I don't want you to feel like I'm throwing a million questions at you, and I don't want you to feel like I'm not going to go do what you're asking me to do. I absolutely am. But it's just going to help me give you what you need quicker if I have a better picture. And I'm just trying to ensure that I'm clear on what the goal is. So even if you need to provide a little context, that's fine, but asking those questions is key. Yes, over here.
Yes, at the end of the day, the guy who provides the resources is the one who makes the decision. But often your key stakeholder does not understand the impact of those decisions. So it's our job as the project manager, when the request is made, to use our triple constraint, look at all the options that work for us in the project. If you're going to increase the work, you increase the resources.
Right.
If you're going to decrease the resources, you decrease the work or you make some other adjustment.
Right.
So we provide all the options that work and let them know what our understanding of the impact is. Then ask them, what other impacts are there to these options? The only ones to choose from are the ones that work for us, that respect the triple constraint. And then that way they are making an informed decision. Often in this situation, the problem is they're making decisions without all the information.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I'm kind of laughing as you're talking because this is the first time we brought up the triple constraint. And that's one of the, it's huge. It's all throughout my book. I talk about it a lot. And as I was writing the book, I was going back to doing the sourcing for it, and I was trying to have definitions for different things and going to the PMBOK, et cetera. And so I would go to the PMBOK, and I would say, well, let me just look up triple constraint in the glossary or the index and, figure out the page. Who knew they got rid of the triple constraint? I'm like, wow, I am really old. It's like the last reference to triple constraint, I think, is in the 3rd edition of the PMBOK. So, I mean, that's a whole nother side. I think they migrated from the triple constraint to something else with 6 and, but I love the good old-fashioned triple constraint. But what you're saying is right on target. It all goes back to good, fast, and cheap. And we cannot have all 3 at the same time. So a huge part of our role is to take in what they're saying they want or need, but then help them understand what are the implications of that. Yes, certainly we can increase our requirements from 100 to 1,000, but this system might not be going live next month. Or we might need to bring in 100 additional resources to work overtime around the clock to make this happen, to meet this date. So what she said is right on point. It's all about helping them understand the trade-offs, the implications, because that's I didn't talk about this at the very beginning, but part of the fallacy in a lot of these workplaces is the higher up you go, the further you become disconnected from the day-to-day work. So just because these people are in decision-making roles doesn't necessarily mean they have the best information to make the decision. I remember when I was at AT&T decades ago, and Joe Naccio was like next in line, heir apparent to Bob Allen to become the next president of AT&T, and he abruptly left the company, and it was like a shock within the telecommunications industry because people were like, you're next in line. Like, why in the world would you leave? I will never forget one of the things that I read in the paper about the interview with him after he left. He said, I ascended so high in the organization that I could no longer get anybody to tell me the truth. And I think that dynamic is so true. The further up you go, the further away you are from the real information, and also the rosier the information tends to get. He was like, everyone coming into my office has good news. He's like, I can't remember the last time somebody came with bad news. So even if it is bad news, they put lipstick on a pig and make it look like good news. So that was such a key point. That is part of the project manager's role, is helping them understand what are the implications, what are the impacts to this particular recommendation. That's the one that's in the bottom right. Point out the triple constraint trade-offs if he or she proposes unrealistic changes to the project. So that's absolutely key. So let me go through these. Clarify, prioritize the triple constraints early and often. Okay, just because you did it way back, last November, doesn't mean that's their current thinking now. So you want to not just talk about the triple constraint, but have them prioritize. Because the way the triple constraints work, you can't have all 3 at the same time. And they can't all be the top priority. Usually you can pick 2 and focus there, and then something has to be secondary. So for example, good, fast, and cheap. When you go to McDonald's, what are you expecting? Fast and cheap, okay? You understand part of the deal. You understand that this is not going to be fine dining. This is not going to be the highest quality meal you've ever had in your life. So the same thing with the projects. You've got to understand what's really, really driving this. And I know sometimes people will say, oh, we want everything. But at the end of the day, something has to be driving it. Is it time? Meaning, they might say, well, Dana, now that you mention it, this system must go live June 15th. That date cannot move. Even if we end up spending a couple extra $1,000, I could deal with that. Or we had to throw a few more resources at some point, I could deal with that. Or even if we didn't have all the bells and whistles, even if some of the requirements weren't in there, I could deal with that. What I cannot deal with is this system not going live by June 15th. That's the type of conversation, that's the information I want to pull out from them. So now I understand, and then the next step is documenting that that's the #1 priority, is the system actually must go live June 15th. So that if and when things change, I know what's changeable and what's not. I know we can't move that date, so maybe I can spend a little extra money, I can, use a contractor if I need to, but you want to clarify that early and often. Next one, we talked about this. Identify and document what is in scope and what is out of scope. I just can't jump up and down about this enough. I'm not even going to go into the whole backstory of when I was a consultant with IBM, we found out that we were really getting burned where we would talk about the scope at the beginning of the project, but then when we would do the kickoff meeting, the final presentation, they would always ask us for something that wasn't in scope. And so we would, say, well, I thought we kind of, talked about this. And they say, well, the vendor analysis, we just assumed since, the RFP, we just assumed since you were doing the vendor analysis that you guys were also doing the RFP that would eventually go out to the vendors. So we changed our paradigm. So what we did from then on was instead of waiting to the end, at the beginning, at the kickoff meeting for every project from that point on, we would have a slide that had in scope and out of scope. And it would have a bullet list of all the items that were in, all the items that were out. Same thing with the Clueless Chameleon. It's so critical to put that on paper in black and white because almost every single time we've presented that either to a project sponsor, a client, a key stakeholder, there's something that's on that out of scope list that they assumed was in or that they wanted to be in. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's okay if you see something over there that we want to move over. And trust me, when I was a consultant at IBM, we kind of wanted that because we'd say, it's out, but for the low, low price of $200,000, we can put it in. So it's not saying that things can't move, but there are implications if we're going to expand the scope or if we're going to increase requirements. I talked about the fact that working with the Clueless Chameleon is not kind of a binary, they say X, you do X, and you're done. It's more iterative. It's kind of shampoo, lather, rinse, repeat. Part of that is developing a mock-up for key deliverables. So maybe they want a business plan or a requirements document or a communications plan or a strategic analysis. These words, they sound great. They mean nothing, okay? I promise you, if I say a business plan, we could come up with 10 to 15 different versions of what a business plan might actually look like. You might use Excel, you might use PowerPoint, Word, yours might be 2 pages, yours might be 15 pages, so just completely different. So we want to, with this type boss, come up, don't spend a ton of time. Do quick and dirty, rapid, agile, okay? Come up with a quick and dirty mock-up, get it in front of them and say, hey, is this close to what you're thinking of? Does this make you think of other things? So you really do want to have that iterative process. We talked about this at the beginning. Identify their soapbox issue early and stress what's in it for them. If you know their butt is on the line to get this system up by June 15th, use that word, not the butt part, but use the rest of the wording about the timing. Say, hey, I want this so that we can go live on June 15th. It's like whatever you want, make it so we can go live on June 15th because that is what's going to set off bells in their head. That's what they resonate with. So you want to certainly stress that. Obtain signatures on the project charter. Why in the world do we want to do that? That sounds so archaic. Oh my goodness. Why don't we just kind of send documents out and we're all in agreement? Why do you think that signature step is there? Proof they saw it. Accountability. I promise you, there is a whole different perspective when I say, hey, not only are we going to talk about the project charter today, but then I'm going to pass it around and each one of you is going to sign it. Then they're like, oh, well, let me look it over and let me get my lawyer to look at it, It not only increases accountability, it changes how they participate in the session. Let me be honest. Some of you are like coming up with your grocery list right now while I'm talking, okay? We're all multitasking, checking email, thinking about what's the best route to get home from here, what's the traffic going to be like. When I say, hey, I'm going to pass around a document, we're all going to sign it in the next 30 minutes. Then you pipe up, okay? Or you might push back. You participate more actively. So when we're talking about these project charter elements and we're talking about team member roles and responsibilities and I say, hey, I need everyone to devote 20 hours, then you're like, well, wait a minute, I can't sign, I can't sign for that. I mean, maybe some weeks I can give you 20 hours. And I promise you at the beginning of the project, that's a good thing. That's what you want. I'd rather have somebody tell me before the project starts, I can't commit to 20 hours. And I've had this. And then we swapped out, we got a different resource, or I added an additional resource to make up the difference. But I could only do that because they told me, because I knew. Typically what happens is they just kind of nod or they're on their BlackBerry or whatever, and then 3 months from now, I'm like harassing them because they're not showing up to meetings. That's what I don't want to happen. So get signatures on that project charter. It's funny, I was teaching a project management class, this has been probably 10 years ago, and there were 2 people, I would say over about 10 years, there were 2 people who raised their hand in the class and told me the exact same thing. They said, you know, you're so right about the signatures. We only had 1 person on the team who refused to sign it, and they were our problem person the entire project. So getting those signatures is key. But one thing I should point out is, you know, I'm not terribly literal about this. I don't think that it has to be overly formal. It's not like you're taking, you know, quill pens and dipping them in ink, and this is the Constitution. Even if you're doing it more virtually, even if you're emailing it out and you're getting email confirmation back that says, yes, I've read it and I agree to it, that's fine as well. You just want to get some sort of confirmation that they are in agreement. That makes a huge, huge difference. This next one, explicitly ask how they will define success for this project. This is something that we learned the hard way. When I was at IBM, I was in the media practice, and so we were doing a lot of work with PGA Tour and Discovery Channel and MGM Film Studios. So at Discovery Channel, we were actually on site for like 2 years. I mean, we worked with them day in and day out. We were there Monday through Thursday. We were there a long time. Very successful projects. They came in on time, on budget. About 6 months after the project was over, Jim had made a call to their executive vice president, who reported to the president of Discovery, who was our main contact. And during that conversation, somehow he mentioned to Jim, he said, oh yeah, well, you know, it was unfortunate that we had to deem the digital asset management project a failure. And so Jim was like, what do you mean? Like our project? And he said, yeah. I was like, well, wait a minute. What do you mean you deemed it a failure? He said, well, you know, technically, you know, the internal metric that Discovery uses is for any capital investment, you must recoup your costs within 18 months. And unfortunately, because the capital investment was so huge, we didn't recoup the cost, you know, in 18 months. So unfortunately, that project was deemed a failure throughout the whole company. And so Jim, like, was livid. And he said, well, we were there for 2 years. Like, why at no point did you mention this internal metric about payback within 18 months? I mean, possibly if we had known that, we might have, you know, been able to tweak some things and make it within the metric. And then, yes, what did he say? You never asked, okay? See, all my suggestions are because we got burned, okay? So after that, we started a best practice where we would explicitly ask the client or the key executive stakeholder, how will you define success for this project? This is actually a technique that I even use to this day. So when people contact me and say, hey, we'd like you to be a speaker at our event, or we want you to facilitate our team retreat in particular. I do a lot of team retreats, and so we talk about goals for the retreat and what they want me to do, et cetera. And I try to always ask this question early on. Please finish this sentence for me. I will consider this retreat a success if. And I will tell you, about half the time, they don't have an answer. And that's okay. That's good. Because A, what you want to do here is if they don't know, if they're kind of clueless, you want to have that space there. And you just put TBD and put the date. Because you want to, it's a little bit of CYA. It's something for you to say, hey, there's still not clarity in terms of what success looks like. But you want to get them thinking about it, and then you want to come back and ensure that you do have an answer in terms of how are we defining success for the project. Define critical success factors and ask for what you need early on. I wrote a LinkedIn article, no, not LinkedIn. I did a webinar on projectmanagement.com. So if you're interested in a little bit more on this topic, in addition to the book, I have several webinars on projectmanagement.com. The one that I did on February 20th, I think it was, I unpack this a lot more. But let me just kind of share the story about this. We've had problems where, in our projects, where at the end of the day, after the project was over, when we look back to why it wasn't successful, a lot of the issues really kind of came back to the project sponsor not doing something that we needed them to do, or them not doing something in a timely manner. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Our timeline is based on the assumption that once we send you a deliverable that requires approval, you haven't like gone to Fiji for 2 weeks and it's sitting in your inbox and you're not gonna respond to us for 2 weeks, because then that subsequently adds time to our timeline. So that would be the type of thing. Or we would be reliant on users to make themselves available for interviews. I mean, little things, and then we couldn't get interview rooms, or a key resource would get yanked off our project midway, and then that would slow us down. So things like that where the sponsor really could have made a key difference. So what we started doing was this. After a project would be over, we would do a debrief, and we would just kind of pull back the layers of the onion and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work, what should we do differently next time? Any of those items that we felt the project sponsor or client could help us with, or were possibly the source of the problem, we rebranded them, and we called them critical success factors, okay? And we said to them, hey, we've looked at our previous projects, and we've identified these 8 factors that we feel are critical to the success of the project. And we want to enlist your support and your agreement on these issues before we start the project. And some of them were small things like their participation in certain key meetings, agreeing to respond to deliverables within 3 days, agreeing that we would have access to certain meeting room space, things like that. Just small things that can end up making a big difference eventually in the project. We would define those really early on, and we'd say, hey, we need your support in these areas. And we would include this as part of the project charter. And again, we would also get them to sign the project charter. So, of course, we've all seen a project charter, hopefully. They don't all have to look the same. Yours might be different. In my experience, these are some of the types of elements that we're typically including in the project charter. And then the wishful thinker. This is a really, really common one, so I'm going to kind of flip the script. We're not going to do a scenario. I know we're running a little short on time. I want to just ask you, what have you used that's worked well for managing that sponsor, that client, that executive level stakeholder who's expecting the impossible? They're the wishful thinker. What have you used? I just want to hear from you. Let me get a couple answers, and then we'll go through some of these. Yes, over here. Okay.
Separating the wants from the needs. And if you've got the list, you have to, if you rank them 1 to 5, you have to have a 1, you have to have a 5.
Okay, so separating the wants from the needs. And then she took it a step further, saying you have to have, prioritizing them. You have to have a 1, have to have a 5. That's really important, because sometimes you'll ask people to like, hey, prioritize low, medium, high, and then everything's high. I mean, so that doesn't really help. So just say, hey, if you had to rank them from 1 to 5, what's most important? And that also helps them go through a process of realizing that there probably are some differences here. Everything is not necessarily a 1. What else? Other techniques you've used effectively? Yes. Just yell. Cost estimates, yes. You want to try to break it down. Sometimes it's funny, we talk different languages, but we all know numbers. So break it down in terms of cost. And that can be so helpful. Kind of related to that, a cousin of that is documenting risk analysis with the team. That's something that can be so, so helpful. I wish we had a whole nother day for a whole nother talk about using risk analysis. But what I like to try to do is if they're asking for something that I think is kind of risky, something I think is plain dumb, or just not a great business decision, of course, I'm not going to tell them that. And again, they have the right to make the decisions they want to make. But what I'll do instead is I'll do my risk analysis. And then I'll point out the risk analysis, say, hey, were we to do this, I anticipate that it might cost $50,000, it might take this much time, these might be some of the concerns that we should be careful with. I just want to ensure that you have all the information to make an informed decision. I am ready, willing, and able to execute, but were I in your shoes, I would certainly want to have all the information. What are your thoughts? Okay? And a lot of times you give them the information, they start to think about it differently and then decide to move in a different direction. Provide choices between triple constraint trade-offs. Push back if their expectations are completely unrealistic. Now, there are lots of different ways you can do risk analysis. This is just one of my favorites, where you get the right people together, get the subject matter experts in a room, brainstorm, what is everything that could go wrong? What are the risk events? So you say, hey, if we're planning a wedding, it could rain, the band might not show, we might forget the ring, all those things that can go wrong. On the next column, you want to estimate probability, either using low, medium, high, or using an actual percentage. Next column, you estimate what is the impact to the project. What is it going to cost us? Again, you can either use dollar figures if you can get that level of specificity, or use low, medium, high. And then severity is the last column. You're going to multiply probability times impact to get severity. So in the first example, you've got 0.5 times 5,000 is $2,500. Or if you've got a low priority event times high impact, that's medium severity. Once you've done all that, we're now going to prioritize them from highest severity item to lowest severity item. And then for those highest severity items, you want to try to think through what are some mitigation strategies and what are some backup plans. Mitigation strategies, something that we're going to do now to try to mitigate the risk. We are trying to prevent this event from occurring. So if we're worried about the band not showing at the reception, we could include a penalty clause in our contract. We could confirm with them a week or a day prior. Those are the mitigation strategies. The backup plans, make an iPod playlist, have a backup band on standby. So these are some of the details you can start to talk through with that wishful thinker. Sometimes just going through this process will illuminate this worst case scenario in their mind, and they'll start to rethink it. And they'll start to also see, hey, what I'm asking for is just not realistic. Okay? So with this, I know that we're running a little bit short on time, so what I'm going to do is just kind of skip to the end. I do want to take a few minutes for questions because I feel like that's so critical for this one. So let me just go ahead and open it up. What questions do you have? Because I also have a few books I want to give away as well. I don't want you guys to miss that. So what questions do you have? Yes, Beck. The micromanager, yes. Actually, that's a wonderful segue into this little handout. If you didn't get one of these on your way in, I want you to definitely get one. Did most of you get one? Okay, I know, 5 minutes. Did most of you get one on the way in? So this is your handy dandy cheat sheet. On here, you've got a list of specific techniques that you can use for 6 different difficult project sponsor personalities. We've got the clueless chameleon, the MIA boss, and the meddlesome micromanager is on one side, okay? So let me just talk through a few of the tips that you can use for the micromanager. One thing is try to figure out why they're micromanaging. Are they just micromanaging you, or do they tend to micromanage everybody and everything? You know, maybe it's an issue with their confidence in you if it's just you. But if it tends to be everybody, you want to figure out what's going on. Is it just that they're nervous about this project because it's so high profile, or do they have specific concerns? Sometimes what people will do is they'll kind of micromanage and ask 1,000 questions because they have a specific concern, and instead of just saying what that actual concern is, they just ask about everything. So try to see if you can hone in on what it is that's kind of making them nervous. Another thing that I recommend for the micromanagers is involve them early on. A lot of times, if they're involved early on, they're in the kickoff meeting, or they're at least there for half the kickoff meeting, they start to have a higher level of confidence that we've done it, we've gone through it. I just mentioned risk analysis. Maybe involve them in the risk analysis process. So now they've been really steeped in that. They know you've thought about all the risks. We've got some backup plans and some mitigation strategies. The more you can relieve their anxiety, the more they're going to need to micromanage. Another suggestion that I have, you proactively suggest a check-in schedule. So a lot of times what you'll do, in fact, I feel like I could have been the micromanaging parent, but because I knew that a parent-teacher conference was coming up, I would hold my questions because I know I'm going to talk to them on Thursday. Like, what's the point of barraging them with emails when I know the parent-teacher conference is coming up? So same thing here. So you proactively say, hey, Jim, this is what I'm thinking in terms of status updates. I will alternate every other Monday morning by 8 o'clock, you'll either have an email in your inbox with detailed status on the project, or we'll do a live meeting every Monday morning where we'll talk through status. And then if anything comes up in between those, I will be certain to come find you to alert you to whatever the particular issue is. So that way they know, hey, I'm going to be getting this status every Monday morning, whether it's live or via email. And what it does is it tends to quell that micromanaging behavior. The other thing I'll say, and there's an example in the book, of is just sit down and have that roles and responsibilities conversation. Just to say, hey, I just want to be sure, like, we're not kind of crossing paths or, stepping on each other's toes. I thought maybe we just take 5 minutes and clarify. And then you pull out specific examples of different activities, like who's going to run the meetings, who's going to manage the discussions or conversations with the client, who's going to be approving deliverables. And you just have a list of maybe 10 different items, and then you've got a column for you and a column for them. And you say, okay, is that going to be in your bucket or my bucket? And so it's more about clarity so that you're not kind of stepping on each other's toes. And a lot of times when you walk them through that, I think it tends to, again, clarify and crystallize for them where those boundaries should be. Because the problem with the meddlesome micromanager is they're really not respecting where those boundaries should be. Okay? So with that, I just want to thank you guys so much. If you want more information, here are some ways to contact me. Of course, the book is available, but if you go on my website, there's tons of free information there. There are videos, white papers. Please link in with me or visit my website or email me. I'm happy to hear from anybody. I do want to give away a few books, so does everybody have one of these? There's some more. There's some more on that table. I left some extras on that table, and I think this table over here. Do people have these? Okay. So this is what I'm going to do. There is a typo on this document. It's a pretty significant typo on this document. So the first 4 people who identify the typo, and this is an example of managing up, because I promise you, as soon as I found out the typo was here, I was mad at the people who developed it. I'm like, why didn't they tell me? Okay, this is my comment, but I'm holding them responsible. So, first 4, come see me, and I will give you a book. And I want to thank you. Again, I want to thank all the organizers. You guys were awesome, were great, and I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful conference.